Hi, everybody, and everybody that's everybody in the room and everybody online. My name is Lou Randall. I'm Executive Director of the Autism Connection of Pennsylvania. And in the room, if you're here, I can give you later handouts. These are just people that we know in Pittsburgh who are autistic, and we show that people have autism or are autistic, all ages, all backgrounds, all everything. It's everybody. We are a lifeline for people with autism and their families, and we do advocacy, support, and information sharing. We take about 140 help requests a month, and we take a lot of those on email, on Facebook message, in the mail. So I really encourage people, if you're working in the field or any kind of business, to really open up your channels to people if they need help, not just an 800 number anymore or whatever. Because a lot of our people, especially if we're autistic, prefer to write and then process things that we write back and forth. And I actually like that better because I can reference what we've talked about. So what I'm going to talk about today is justice and disability in the system. So part of my job, sometimes I get to teach law enforcement. And so I look at all the perspectives, and I have friends in law enforcement, and I've got friends in the disability community. And so we pretty much needed to think about things that are related to people with hidden disabilities and that kind of thing. So I thought about this a lot, and I think that the best way that people learn is through stories. And again, we handle 140 requests for help per month, and a lot of our requests, they start with parents who've just had diagnosis happening with their little ones, all the way through adults that think they're autistic maybe, through people who are homeless, and people that have been arrested and heading to, unfortunately, jail or prison. And so a lot of these people now I've known for, I've been in the field for a long time. So my original 6-year-old clients are about 34 years old. So I've kind of watched people go through the lifespan and watched pretty unfortunate things happen to them throughout that. So the first thing I'm going to talk about are hidden disabilities generally, but I'll probably focus more on autism because that's where I mainly work. Also knowing that people, listen, we don't all have just one thing, right? I've got like allergies and migraines, and I'm nearsighted. So people have lots of different co-occurring conditions, and we'll talk about those. So in hidden disabilities, when we work with our partners in that, we work with people who are autistic, and that is, I say that on purpose. Autistic people, generally my adult friends prefer to be referred to as identity first, because that's their identity. They don't just go home and take it off and put it in the closet somewhere, so there's a lot of pride around autism. So just so you know, I'm going to say autistic people, and I might say people with autism also. People with intellectual disability, people with mental illness, deaf people, again, that's a cultural term, people with brain injuries or post-traumatic stress disorder, generally are the people that we think about when we talk about hidden disabilities. And again, people can have multiples across there or things that happen together. So when I look at the police part of this, so that's our disabled community that we're referencing. When I work with police officers, and I've done a lot of police training over the last 3.5 years, and I'm certified by the Pennsylvania State Police as a civilian instructor, which helps because we have to kind of like, we've really got to bring, I think, those worlds together a little bit more. Some officers I work with have disability in their families, so they're very attuned to this, and they're very strong advocates in their departments, and they're often my training partners. Some are great in their willingness to learn, so they might not have disability in their family, but they're really open to learning, and they're really just really compassionate, and they want to work on that and learn more about the elements around disability and how they can best encounter and support people. And then like any other field, we've got some officers that maybe not great hires. And a lot of, I think, the challenge in the upper levels of police departments I talk to is just weeding people out and finding the best hires in the first place. Some people aren't that willing to learn, to be honest, and some people aren't that compassionate like any other field, right? It's just we've got a mix of people. So along with what I talk to, and the way I wrote my presentation is to think about if you have a disability, always please explain yourself, and don't assume that people in these roles of authority know anything about it. I would walk in and just assume they don't know much about it. So if you can self-identify, if that's in talking, if you can self-identify with documentation, a doctor's letter, an ID card, something like that. There's not legislation right now to have this on like a license or on county ID card, but that's sometimes in the works. But, and also if you have a family member and there might be an issue, so always really put that up front and repeat it. If there's like a domestic call or a car accident or a fire, like please let people know. Just don't assume that people know much about it. So you can also keep your health information on your cell phone. If you're a person with a disability that might lose your ability to talk, keep it on your device, your cell phone, wherever it is where you can push a button and identify yourself that way for people. So that's part about being a self-advocate. And if people want to know, there are some self-advocacy trainings coming up through the Pittsburgh Center for Autistic Advocacy, so let me know or contact us. We can put you in touch with those soon. So around when police officers or law enforcement people show up on a scene, I think a lot of times the thoughts are running through their head all the time. There's just a lot of thoughts running through people's heads, and training kind of goes with that. Traditional training around policing tended to be like contain, control, get things under control, and it can be more, historically more aggressive, more commands, more like fast kind of expectations. Police officers usually feel like they're always at risk. I mean, just walking down the street because of, there are things like ambushes and people are sometimes out to get them. They know that people are unpredictable, and they know that people they meet might be high or drunk or just bad acting, so that's just something in their head. They know that some people have criminal intent and might harm themselves or other people or the officer. Their job is to protect the public, and they've seen all kinds of trauma. They've seen lots and lots of suicides where they've been there and tried to prevent that and lost that battle. They've walked into lots of violent crimes, violent car crashes. And in my opinion, there's not enough at all trauma care for them. So we're looking at people that have seen a lot of trauma that haven't been adequately supported in the past decades at least. Because traditionally, if you're a police officer and you say, hey, having a hard time, you lose your weapon, your desk duty, you might have been, kind of like put aside. And so it's just been a problem. So, and the last thing that they want to think about, or they tend to think about, like all of us, they want to go home in one piece. And if I meet officers in training, it's like, look, I'm not judging anybody. I want you guys to be safe, you women to be safe, and we want to talk about disability at the same time. So why police officers and law enforcement meet people with disabilities? Generally, because the first thing is that people with disabilities are most frequently a crime victim versus a crime perpetrator. So a lot of the talk around that, which we probably won't get into that much today, is that we always want to presume competency. And if we're interviewing witnesses or taking testimony or victims' statements, that we should be allowed, first of all, presume the person's competent, that they may not be able to express themselves traditionally. But you can always take statements in writing, in texting, in typing, whatever, word processing kind of things. Pointing, using a device. So there's like a lot of different ways that we want to help people learn how to do that. They might meet somebody with a hidden disability because the person might look or act differently, because maybe their brain's firing off different signals. They might have repetitive movement. They might be more like rocking. They might be moving their hands a different way. They might be biting their lips a lot. They might be blinking or just doing different things because their brain's firing off extra signals, which is really common in people with Tourette syndrome or autism or just different, or brain injuries sometimes too. They may be making extra sounds, so if somebody's deaf, they're not aware that the rest of us don't make a lot of vocalizations because they don't hear them. Or people with autism may be expressing themselves without English words that we're used to or whatever their language might be. So extra sounds that way. People that they might meet may not be able to respond to a command. So if I'm a police officer and there's something happening and I called or I walk up and I just tell you, please step back or whatever it might be, and you don't respond to me, you might not have even been the focus of the call in the first place, but if you're not acting in a way that's obedient and, right on it, you might get my attention more, and I might think about, well, why are you being non-compliant with me? Why aren't you following my commands? And we get into a whole other kind of avenue. People with hidden disabilities might look away from the speaker or the person who's sort of used to being in authority. And in our culture, generally, if I'm not looking at you, apparently I'm not paying attention, although I know with autistic people especially, if they're not looking at you, generally that means their ears turned towards you and they're listening to you. and they're focusing on the hearing part of it and not getting themselves, like there's not a competing visual with that because it's just easier for them to listen. They may appear in all these behavioral ways to look guilty because police officers are trained to look at human behavior and figure out who looks like they're guilty, who looks like they're trying to avoid me, who looks like they're trying to flee or fight or whatever that is. So they would assume generally, let me just say this, like probably most police officers are not going to assume any disabilities happening. The first thing they're going to think about is typical behavior, generic behavior. Sometimes I call it, if I'm not talking about disabled people or autistic people, I call it boring. Like the boring brain is just going to like comply and react the way that's predictable. So there's that. People with disabilities in general, especially intellectual disabilities or autism, are 3 to 6 times more likely to be a victim of a crime throughout their lifetime, which if somebody's sexually assaulted or bullied or whatever when they're kids, they're definitely much more likely to have a PTSD type of response. So they're going to fight, flee, or freeze. And if I'm nervous around a police officer and I'm not sure what they want me to do because I'm not processing everything, I might fight. I might flail. I might have more of a reflex reaction to people. And if you strike a police officer, that's a felony. So like we can't go near these things. And I've seen that happen many times with people with autism when they're not really able to process things in a way and behave in a way that's expected of them is resisting arrest. And there might have been nothing happening, and all of a sudden one touch, one fling, and things start to happen physically, and the charges sort of start to add up. The last thing, not in a particular order, but have had cases where people are homeless. A lot of homeless people, I'm going to say like anecdotally, could be autistic or have a hidden disability, and they're out there on the streets and they're trying to live. So if there's a fight over food or over their possessions or somebody's bothering them or whatever that might be, just your basic kind of survival instinct, which can get the attention of law enforcement. So what I was going to talk about today, knowing that I'm going to just ask for show of hands because people can't see that are on the call. Who here works in the field, like justice-related people, mental health people? How about parents, family members? Okay, that's kind of what I was more expecting also. So I'd say there's a few people here in the profession. Maybe it's half and half. And some of us are both, right? Yeah, some of us are both. So I'm going to tell you about worst-case scenarios, not to freak you out, but these are things that have happened. And these are past cases. Like I won't talk about current ones because that would be not helpful to them. Again, I don't want to freak you out, but these are real things. And some of this I wrote, if you look at the text of it, towards the person with a disability, if you need to take this home and say, look, we're going to read this and kind of put this into play at your house and discuss this kind of stuff. The first thing I'm going to talk about is online crime. And for people that can see the visual, I kind of want you to look at the FBI agent who is on a computer. And this, when I talk to my therapy friends and my psychology friends, and they'll say, please start with this, because online crime, in terms of a person with a hidden disability, is one of the most problematic things, a common thing that's happening with people. So if I've had a hard time making friends, I'm probably going to have a hard time with romantic relationships. I might be bored, whatever, go online and look at pornography. Real life, that's just what happens. When people, especially with certain disabilities, are collectors, their whole life they've collected Digimon cards and Pokemon cards and baseball cards and whatever, can't start to collect images because that sort of like goes in the line of that personality and the way their brain works. When you start collecting a lot of images, you're going to get people that are underage, and that's a crime. And we need to really be very upfront with people that are online that are looking at imagery or videos because they will download child pornography. They will share it, not knowing. You don't know how old, and I'll talk to my autistic friends in their early teens, mid-teens. You don't know how old those people are. You don't know anything about these people. Here's what the law looks like and how they address it. And the FBI and people do look for people's online behavior. And I have had a case in probably 5 years ago where somebody went to work and set their computer to download automatically. And the feds thought that was like one of the biggest child pornography processors in the country because he was just really good at it. And he did go to federal prison. And disability is just not a defense. And I know that people will talk about this after me. And I guess I feel like one way, when we look at IEPs and people in school and we talk about manifestations of disability and we get in there and we need to do that so that people aren't punished as much as we can help during school. But I feel like sometimes it sets up a bit of a false sense of security because you step outside that building, if it's a crime, it's a crime. And nobody wants to know you had an IEP, very, very rarely. It can kind of come into your defense at some point, but nobody, I guess I've heard a lot of people say like, well, what do you mean that he's autistic? How could they possibly charge him? Because they can't, because they do. Because the law is just the law. And then you have to unwind that later on. So you have charges. Hopefully that comes into play when you're dealing with the defense part of it. And then we have people in jail. And then we have to try to help them while they're in and help train their staff and try to make that more humane while they're there, which is a lot of work. So I wanted to just sort of make that point that if you have people or you're a person with a disability yourself, stuff that happens at your house that you think is private, if it's online, anybody can see it, it's not private. It's easy to think if you're in your basement and, nobody knows. Trust me, no. That's like a false sense of security there. And the second piece I wanted to talk about is just basically trauma. So the picture I have for that is a bread roll because it looks really innocent. So I kind of want you to think about afterward when I teach this way, the most basic things can trigger off, like bread can trigger off a legal or an incident anyway. So I had a friend who is older now, but he was bullied all the time in school, and he had things happen like kids would follow him from the bus and smash his head against the sidewalk when nobody was looking, or just set him up constantly. And he's autistic, so his mind would always go to like the immediate today. So if the bully who had knocked his head against the pavement last week came up and smiled at him, he would think, oh, he's my friend today, or he's sorry or something. So the setup for him with the bread was one day in the cafeteria, this boy said, who had bullied him, hey, would you like this roll? I have an extra dinner roll. Would you like to have this? And he's thinking, he's smiling at me. It's cool. Maybe this is a little, peace offering. And then after he starts to eat it, the boy says, oh, by the way, I wiped that on my shoe, which triggers off all of the trauma and the abuse he's had. So he starts to fight. So who gets all the legal, all the attention from security and, all the authorities is the person who's been bullied and triggered. And to try to teach him at the time, I think part of the school approach was to ignore people. When you're autistic, that's a lie. And do autistic people appreciate false lies? No, it doesn't process. How do you ignore something that's bad? So between that and his sort of just survival instinct and his fight or flight response, constantly would have these kind of issues. And again, as an adult, if somebody were to just offend him, that could easily go into an incident where he might get police attention and then have charges. The next one, again, sorry for the bad news part of it, but we'll talk about how, I think Jeff will help me to also talk about some remedies for these. The picture I have for this, if you can't see it, is a snake. So snakes, think about, if you see reptiles in the future, think about predators, because predators are a pretty big concern for me across the hidden disability spectrum of people. It's why when people say, well, why don't deaf people have a sign on their car that says they're deaf? Why do deaf people not want to have a sign on their hospital door? Hey, I'm deaf, I need. What does that do for people? And you can talk back. What does it do if you put a sign out that says I'm deaf? It's a label. What else?
Violating their rights.
It violates their rights, but if I'm not going to do it also voluntarily because it says to somebody, I'm a pretty good victim. You can sneak up on me. You can, steal my whatever. I maybe can't call for help. So there's a debate around, do I self-identify? And I totally get it. People can choose to do that how they want. So my friend who's autistic winds up at a vocational school, And, again, hasn't had a ton of friends in his life, so he gets befriended by an older man and is asked to do some things that are not legal, which he does because he's threatened, by the way. It's sort of like this strange bullying friendship kind of thing. If you don't do that, I'm going to do this. So he moves back home, and Mom finds his phone, and she finds a lot of texts from this person. And they're grooming texts, like, hey, I miss you, can we hang out, blah, blah, blah. I want to come see you. And then one day, I'm thinking, this is 3 years ago, he's missing. And he had told his boss, hey, can you just drop me off down the street? I'm going to walk home, which is where he was meeting this person from an hour away. And he's missing for 3 days. Not cool. And she finds out through social media where he is. And the police go out to that area, and they knock on this person's door. They knock on his relative's door also. So the guy knows they're looking kind of onto this and looking for him. So all of a sudden, our buddy shows up at his house in the east side of Pittsburgh in the alley. It was 16 degrees outside. He's scared his mom's going to be mad. So he's just outside without a coat. And she's walking her dog, and she finds him. Thank goodness. So the predatory part of, like, why another person might meet the police, not get in trouble, but why there's police interactions, because our guys can, or women can be very vulnerable and stumble into these kind of issues. Also, when he got home, he hid his underwear. And we never had any resolution to that whole part of it. But these victimization kind of things can creep up on people when they're not aware of how can you be, you know, when you're trusting to that level. Here's one that kind of worked out better. And the picture I have for this is bottles of vodka on a counter. And this family's son is 22 years old, and he likes a girl in town who's 16, and the family's like, this is not cool. So they move an hour away to get a new start, kind of like get where he could get a job and things like this. And the girl starts texting him, saying, like, I'll come visit you, because he's lonely. Again, has a hard time with friendships. I'll come visit you if you can buy me some vodka. And he's like, huh, all right. Doesn't tell anybody. Enters his neighbor's house. He's met the new neighbors. They're very friendly. They go to visit. He leaves. Goes back after she is asking him to kind of get her vodka, and enters her house where they're sleeping in the house at night. So he's convicted. By the time I met him, he was already convicted. Breaking and entering and other things. And why he was thinking this. So the family called me after he was convicted, but he was waiting for sentencing. And I said, which I would love to ask, to tell any officer or judge or anybody, lawyer, what were you thinking? Not in a critical way, like, what were you thinking? But tell me what you were thinking about. And he said, well, they said come back anytime. They said our house is your house, like, you're welcome. Come back anytime. Help yourself. So we did. He was supposed to go to federal prison, but he was sentenced to 5 years probation, and the mom's like, he's not going to meet them every week for 5 years. He doesn't think he did anything wrong. And when you ask him what he's thinking now, he says, I didn't break anything. So how do you break and enter when I didn't break anything? Like, I went in the back door. So he's really convinced that everybody else is still wrong because they told him to come back anytime. So his ability to maybe comply with his responsibilities is, in 5 years is a really long time, I think, to be on time and meet with people and act like, right, you'd have to act, honestly, so that's a tough thing. When the judge asked him, given the exact precise set of circumstances, would you do that again? What do you think he said? Yeah, not a liar. And when you put that question to an autistic person, that's very logical. Well, exact is exact, so yeah. And sometimes they'll say that like, yeah, like it might sound sarcastic, but they're probably thinking, this person's a judge, and what kind of trick question is this? You know, and they kind of get that way. So that's an issue we have with literalism and people taking things literally. Help yourself, come back anytime. Oh, it's kind of like vague kind of things where people kind of get into an issue. I know that Jessica talked about IEP stuff. I just want to put a note out there. The picture I have for the next story is a man writing in a book, young man. Please, if you're in schools or if you're anywhere in programs where you're asking people to journal their private thoughts, you're going to get the private thoughts. And if you're a mandated reporter or involved with kids like in high school, and the person has private thoughts about a girl they like, let's not go there. So especially if somebody is angry also, sometimes guidance counselors say, well, write out your feelings. You might not want to know what people, we all think really dark thoughts sometimes, and we just don't tell people. But if you're asking a person with a disability to write out their most private thoughts, there's two lessons. One is don't ask if you're in a position where you have to tell people or act on that. And two is if you're a person with a disability, don't write your private thoughts online or give them to people if they're private's private. So kind of making boundaries kind of there would be very helpful because that can kind of just go all kinds of different ways. I don't want to get too far because you can tell my story. Okay. Hi.
When a counselor is asking a person about their thoughts, isn't that a privileged information type situation or not?
I've seen it with guidance counselors, so I think they're in a different position in a school, depending on what the thoughts are. If they look menacing or threatening to somebody else. There's also where you breach confidentiality if somebody's at risk. That's part of your obligation. So there's breach, and how to breach or when to breach is sometimes a little bit fuzzy, but in this day and age with like zero tolerance and all the kind of policies that people have in schools, that can go either way. Yeah, like therapy, like private counseling might be different, but still, if somebody's writing out a threat to somebody else, it's not going to stay privileged. And I don't know if that, you guys can talk about that too. Do you have
No, it's just schools get really jumpy in the era of mass shootings, understandably. And if there is something that indicates that a kid has a propensity towards violence, regardless of whether it's a kid with a disability or not, they're not thinking first, how do we take care of your kid with a disability? They're thinking, how do we make sure we're not the next school shooting? And they're ruthless about that because they're scared, and there's a perceived link between mental health conditions and school violence, which is sometimes dead on and sometimes not dead on. But they're going to whatever degree there's confidentiality, schools are going to do what they need to do to protect their students. And it's important that people with disability and their parents know this stuff.
Yeah. So the question was, because I was supposed to repeat it and I didn't, isn't there a confidentiality in the relationship of a counselor and a student? And then Jeff's answer also was that schools are really jumpy in this era of school shootings and I'll say sexual assault concerns. They're going to err on the side of their job, honestly, and their reputation in the school's safety as a whole, and they're not going to take care of or focus on that one individual. Like the individual's rights are not going to trump the whole school climate type of a thing, generally.
And if I can just add on, part of the difficulty is that parents, there are procedures that schools should follow when they address disability-based harassment that could look like bullying or hazing or things like that. And sometimes what parents find out is that by talking about how much bullying their kid has been experiencing, the school starts worrying, okay, is this kid going to snap? Is this kid now going to become dangerous? And so, even when you're trying to advocate on behalf of your kid, you're sometimes inadvertently putting him under him or her under higher scrutiny because of, again, some perceptions about, why school shootings occur. So that's another real concern.
So stigma comes in, right? If you raise a red flag and say my kid's been bullied a lot, that you might accidentally put all the focus on your kid as maybe they're going to be snapping, or they'll snap, or they'll be the one that kind of is suddenly the target of the problem versus what's been done to them. And I think I'll close just by a last story because it relates to that, just around the whole dynamics of disability and how things look. So perception's most of the issue. If things look like a crime or look criminal, it's up to the person, if they're charged with that or accused of that, to prove that they didn't have criminal intent. Basically, in my experience, that's been my issue with people with autism, at least. And I've had this happen a lot. People may be very lonely, and they may be applying rules a different way. So if I'm a guy or a girl who likes somebody. The picture I have, again, is it's a bagel shop. So think about it. Next time you see a bagel, you're going to think about this story, I think. And I like, let's say I'm a guy, and this is a case we had, and I like a girl. And she says that she doesn't want to hurt my feelings by blowing me off. So she'll say, you know, I have a boyfriend. You might be really kind of mad if I talk to you anymore. So white lie, right? She kind of gets out of the situation with a white lie. And so my client goes to watch her work to make sure her boyfriend doesn't hurt her for 5 or 6 hours, sitting in his car watching her in the bagel fest. Finally, she kind of notices he's out there, calls her dad, police get called. What does that look like? Looks like stalking, right. I've had people follow people in school a whole lot if they're just have a crush on somebody and they want to make sure that if they're around them to like open a door or whatever, but they're following them like a foot away, you know, because we're not always aware of our social kind of, I don't say norms, but the expectations or culture of other people. I've also had people apply the rule, which we teach people, if at first you don't succeed, try again, and have people. I know, people here are kind of like, they live this, right? Yeah. So, but you can't do that when you're texting somebody 120 or 200 times a day because that's harassment. If the person says no, then we're having an issue with that. So I just want to kind of end my part of the talk with, if there's any suspicion you have that your person is being looked at funny if it's in school or as an adult, if there's any kind of even inkling that they might meet law enforcement for whatever reason, I would love to have you have them meet with an attorney ahead of time, let them have their card, let them see their face. Let's talk about, you know, what really can happen so that it's not just you telling them if you're a parent or a guardian, but they've got an official person saying, look, here's what's happened to whatever of my clients. Also, here's my card. Don't talk to anybody. Write down these rules. Call me first. That kind of thing in case they do get picked up. If somebody is arrested, I've seen families say like, well, you know, oh, I was asked by the detective to have my son write a letter of apology. Yikes. That is a signed confession. So if people are acting friendly, like police are allowed to do certain things and say certain things that may not be accurate or true. So get with an attorney first. Don't wait and say, like, I'm going to see how this works out. I'm going to see, you know, they were pretty nice about it, so I'm going to just wait and see. Waiting and seeing in this realm, like seriously, if people call me, I'll say ahead of time, mortgage your house, call your grandparent, whoever it is that you can need to get money from, try to get some money for a private attorney if you can. If not, if you have a public defender, we have people that can help talk with them to help them understand the disability part, because that's pretty key. It's not a defense, but you can educate people if it's your local magistrate, if it's whoever it is, and jump in there early. You don't want to wait until a hearing happens. Sometimes people are in jail for a year waiting for their hearing, because if somebody arrests somebody and then we find out there's a disability, most judges aren't going to say like, oh, they screwed up. I'm going to continue and continue. And you have somebody sitting in jail for that time until kind of things work out. Possibly get the charges dropped, but sometimes that's a long time. So, yeah, my time is done. Call us anytime you need help. I'll give you my number here, and I think it's on slides, or you can get it from Achieva if that's not up. Who's next?
Can I ask
sure.
one question? What do you think about having parents of young adults or even people with disabilities who have a non-disabled support systems around them, of talking to local police in advance of anything happening and saying, hey, this is who I am, this is what my needs are, this is what I'm good at, this is what I'm bad at.
Right.
Do you encourage that or do you discourage it?
No, I encourage people. So first in Allegheny County, which might be some people that are here, there's a thing called the Special Needs Registry, which is optional. You can go online. You can put in any person with a special need in your house. It could be your grandmother who has dementia. It could be your person. It could be yourself. So in case any call associated to that address, in terms of fire, missing person, whatever it might be, the screen will pop up in the car of whatever you filled in, like the flag on that. So a person with a disability, and you can write in there, loves red jelly beans, terrified of dogs, will come to you if you sing Winnie the Pooh. Whatever it is, you can fill all that stuff in so that when people are responding, because we have great police officers that want to know stuff, and they don't always want to spend time with you interviewing you at your house if they know he loves the fountain that's 5 blocks away. No, they're going to start there, or they're going to start in different places to help find or resolve that. You also don't want to have like a random domestic call come out if if there's a person with a disability who's having, say, a meltdown or whatever could be happening, that could come out as a domestic, which is a whole other response than a person with a disability might be upset. You know, we have to come in quietly and do whatever we need to do. So if you can't do that, yes, I would have people meet the police so people can identify them, get to know them a little bit. I do have a friend of mine who does wander around his neighborhood playing Pokemon Go and talking to himself, and he's 26 or 27. So that might look a little bit different to people, but if the officers know that that's what's happening, then they'll just know that's what's happening. I don't encourage people to, this is going to sound funny, I don't love the police meet and greet ice cream, come hug me, because I don't want your 40-year-old person or you as a 40-year-old person to be conditioned to run up and hug a cop. That's dangerous for everybody, because that person does not know who's coming. And we did have a person with intellectual disability in the Hill District come running at a police car and diving in the window with the guy driving, and the staff was there saying, like, he's got he's got a disability, and they kind of all could be there at the right time and say that, but I don't encourage a lot of this really close affectionate stuff, because as my buddies get older, they might be wanting to grab that taser, like, what's the frequency of your taser, what's, you know, guns, badges. I just want people to have, like, a distance, and it's hard to teach that distance, like, we don't have it as people, it's hard to teach that, but yeah, I let people let them know.
And the other thing I would just ask you to talk about is how do you, sometimes people who have disabilities have crises in the home, and who you call when you have a crisis is you know, super important. And there's people who will call the cops instead of calling Resolve
or somebody
or Cactus or something. And so I think sort of making sure that the people you work with understand, if you're working with families with disabilities, making sure when do you call the cops and when do you call Resolve, because the cops are going to cop, and because that's what they do, and Resolve's going to do what they do.
Yeah.
And so I think it's sort of making sure that families who are going through some difficult situations know which resources.
Yeah, so if you live in a county where you've got a mobile crisis, that's a really nice resource to get to know. You can also get to know them early a lot of times, so if you have the opportunity, you know your person might be upset or have a more physical reaction or whatever, or leave and run, whatever that might be. It's nice to have your mobile crisis people know them ahead of time and come over just to build a relationship and get to know each other. You don't have to be in a crisis to call Resolve. You can have them come out and establish that connection earlier. If you do call them in a crisis, because of the way the world is funding, they may not always be available. So it's really hard to say that it depends. And I've been at Resolve. I encourage you to visit on a tour if you ever can. Look at the board, see where they're. Allegheny County is huge. That's what they generally cover. They could be all over points of the county and not have a free team to come to your house if you have an incident. But that might be a first call you make if somebody's having a meltdown or somebody's upset. And I've had them also stay afterward and sit in the driveway for an hour to make sure it's resolved. I mean, not to, you know, their name. But, yeah, so they're pretty thorough when they have the resources to do that, yeah.
What did you call that service to meet the police special needs?
In Allegheny County, you can go online, and it's a Special Needs Registry. And if you Google Special Needs Registry, Allegheny County, you'll get the form, and you can fill that out. There's also a thing in Pennsylvania called the Premise Alert, which is a piece of paper that has fill in the blank, and you can bring that also to your local, because everybody's got a different system. The state police, you know, sometimes are covering huge rural areas, and it's not a great system. I'm trying to get them to get the software for this, like the Allegheny County has, to apply that to the state police, but it's hard to get systems to kind of coordinate and talk to each other. The other thing I would love to do is go to PennDOT and say, hey, PennDOT, when I have my car registration and my person's registered on a registry at the county, it's to associate the car to the house address information. But again, getting these systems to, like, connect, because I don't want it just at your house. You could have, it's just a car accident, but if your registration associates your house, you should be able to get that same data. PennDOT has a yellow dot. You can look at yellow dot, Pennsylvania. Yellow dot on your car, the sticker says there's medical information in the glove box for anybody, if you're diabetic or whatever. The issue with that, honestly, if I go out to do police trainings, they've never heard of it. So there's great ideas. We just have to keep populating them. I know City of Pittsburgh now in the academy teaches the yellow dot for sure, so they all know. But it depends on where training is. So I'll hang around and answer questions later. Anything else you're thinking about, or good for now? I think you're up, Jeff.
Awesome.
Thanks.
I'm going to move the microphone.
Where do you want it?
I'm just going to. If we don't have a PowerPoint presentation, I'm not going to be standing in front of anyone's view on anything. So I'm just going to put this here, because for small groups like this, it feels weird for me to be behind the podium. I'm Jeff Reuter. I'm an attorney who for probably close to 22 years, in one way or the other, has been working with youth with disabilities. I've got a small law practice in Pittsburgh of 7 attorneys, and we work exclusively, almost exclusively, in the area of student rights and disability. The issues we have been dealing with over the years regarding children and the juvenile justice system have led us to sort of create a pilot program called the Student Disability Advocacy Program. And we are targeting working with the juvenile justice system to provide them with the information they need to understand how children can be, students with mental health conditions, kids with mental health conditions, can be supported in the schools using existing federal and state law rather than having to put them into a youth detention center in Danville, okay? We are, there is a lot of support available for kids, and we're going to talk about sort of what those supports are. I try to make presentations. I'm more of a talker than a speaker. I like being interrupted. I like being asked questions. I want to make sure this is valuable to all of you. If there's something I'm not accurate about or I'm unclear about, or you want to know how it relates to a specific situation, interrupt, please. Put your hand up. I want to make sure that whatever I'm doing is valuable for you. So we're going to talk about disability and mental health conditions and how they relate to the juvenile justice system. Just a couple of facts to explain why this is an issue. There's an estimate that 65% of the youth in the criminal justice system, in juvenile and adult juvenile justice systems, meet the criteria for having a disability. There's a huge correlation between disability and justice and the justice system. Students with disabilities are incarcerated at a rate 4 times higher than non-disabled peers. Disabled peers are only 12% of an enrolled school population in Pennsylvania on average. However, they are overrepresented at 75% of school-related arrest and delinquency referrals. And what our belief is that the juvenile justice system is largely driven by school disability problems. And those of you who work in this field, that may be something that either meets your understanding or it's different. Understand, and I always try to acknowledge this, my perspective comes from the work I do. I'm focusing on kids with disabilities. There's probably more to this problem than where I see it. But what we understand presently is that addressing mental health conditions is there's a direct correlation to how well a school addresses students' mental health conditions and the need for intervention from the juvenile justice system. We're pretty confident about that in the research and in the literature that's out there now. So what we're going to talk about is why this matters. Our belief is that the giving good advocacy for students with disability can stop the school-to-prison pipeline that exists for people with disabilities. The school-to-prison pipeline is very familiar to folks who are conscious of sort of the race basis of this. There is a similar pipeline to jail for people with mental health disabilities. If you overlap race and mental health, it exponentially jumps. Okay, this is so. Our premise is that if you can use state and federal law to advocate for kids with disabilities in school, you can keep them out of the juvenile justice system. But in going to what Lou said earlier about how, when you're 18, people don't care if it's a manifestation of your disability. You can use the time a young adult or a young person is in school to help them learn how to address these behaviors, which are going to get them in jail. So it's really blunt. It's really, we're not trying to polish this. But we think that there are underutilized services that schools are legally required to provide, which can help avoid this outcome. So what we want to talk about just a little bit is what supports are out there for kids in schools, for young adults in schools. And keep in mind, when I say kids, I'm talking about school-age children and children up to the age of 21 who are in school, who are working on their transition goals. And most of the kids who are going to struggle with this stuff are going to be eligible for ongoing services through the end of the school year where they turn 21. The first thing we're going to talk about is eligibility. And again, I want to, these might be topics that folks are very familiar with, and if so, I'll move on to other stuff. But one of the things that we always want to talk about is that who's eligible for supports in school. Is it just kids who are getting bad grades? And the answer is no, it's not. You can be eligible for an IEP or for a Section 504 plan. I'll explain the distinction between those. But you can be eligible for disability-based supports regardless of whether or not you're getting good grades. The reason why that is that schools have the obligation under the law to provide services for kids when their mental health condition, when their disability negatively or adversely affects school performance. It doesn't mean you have to be failing, okay? It doesn't mean that you have to get D's or F's. It doesn't mean that you have to get below basic on your standardized testing. What it does mean is, does your behavior cause you to elope and run out of class once a week? It won't affect the grade, but it affects your school performance, okay? Do you have a disability that stops you from going to school, okay? Do you have a disability that causes social problems between you and your peers or you and your teachers? All of these issues are identified under the law as being under what they'll call the domains of faith. Not just academic, but social, emotional, and behavioral, okay? These are the kids who are entitled to support. The difference between a 504 plan and an IEP, they're both, and we're going to use them somewhat interchangeably. There's more, 504 plan is primarily reasonable accommodations and services and supports and modifications. An IEP is a different classification where there's actually the provision of special education, which is modifying how instruction is delivered in the classroom. Under either of these laws, behavioral, emotional, and social supports can be offered to kids with disabilities. So it doesn't matter whether or not, ultimately it doesn't matter which classification it is, but these are both the services we're talking about should be offered under both, just pursuant to existing law. That can look like, or let me say this one thing. Getting behavioral supports it's easier under the IDEA with an IEP, just because people know how to do it. But it should be eligible for anyone with a recognized disability that needs accommodations, modifications, or supports, even under a 504 plan. Couple of little points on identification. It's not on parents to ask, okay? Schools have something called the child find obligation, where if they have reason to believe that a child is demonstrating some behaviors or some needs which could be related to a disability, it's their obligation to evaluate the student. The parent doesn't have to agree to it, but it's their obligation to try to help. So it doesn't, if the parent not asking, that's not an excuse. So once a kid gets identified, and the kid gets an IEP or a 504 plan, the school has an obligation to provide what's called a free and appropriate public education space. For a kid with behaviors that can lead them to the juvenile justice system, what we're talking about primarily are behavioral supports, okay? Pennsylvania specifically has really good law on what sorts of behavioral supports should look like for kids with disabilities in school. There's and I want to try to keep to my outline. The broad, and I would encourage, if you've got questions about this, a good resource to use is Patten, P-A-T-T-A-N, has a lot of resources about positive behavioral support plans, and that's what they're called under the law in Pennsylvania. A positive behavioral support plan should try to address the child's negative behaviors in a positive way by trying to understand the function of the negative behavior and giving a positive, more socially acceptable way of having a kid have whatever need that they're having that's not being met, have them figure out how to meet that need in a socially acceptable way. There's an evaluation, which is the first step, which is called a functional behavioral assessment. What that is an FBA, and it's supposed to determine the function of the behavior that a kid is exhibiting. If you have a kid on the spectrum, who, like one of the kids that Lou talked about, who frequently has difficulties by taking things literally, and because of taking things literally, they will get into problems because they are, the most common thing we see is, hey, that girl likes you. Then the kid with a disability says, wow, that's awesome, I'm going to go talk to that girl. And what happens is that because of their literalness and some of the naivete that you see, they become sort of easily manipulated. So if there's a bullying aspect that we can focus on, but the more important thing is having school personnel try to teach that kid how to address those behaviors. How to, instead of, when you get told something when you're being manipulated, how can you learn to recognize that someone is taking advantage of you? How can you, and we can talk about part of the.
I have one. So just one example of that is if somebody says to this person, hey, she'll think you're really cool if you jump in that puddle. And so one way to teach around that is to have them, if they're not sure, say, okay, you do it first. Particularly in chess. It's just like a teach teaching a certain skill or a common fact can help. One example.
And one of the things that a behavioral support plan can include is having the provision of social skills instruction to help kids, and not just sort of, normal support of, hey, don't do that, Tommy, that's a bad idea. But instead, going through a evidence-based curriculum and that is targeted for people on the spectrum, in this case, which will help them learn skills. It's one of the areas of FAPE, of a free and appropriate public education, that schools have the obligation to teach kids. Now, the other ways we can talk about this would also be, kids on the spectrum, and we're just going to run with the kids that Lou's been talking about just to stay consistent. But those kids as well will get frequently overwhelmed and elope, or in a negative social interaction, they can become aggressive because they don't have a way of addressing their internal emotions that is more easily and readily available for them. So what we can talk about for kids who feel the need to elope, from negative sensory stuff, or from negative, or from feeling overwhelmed, or from being out of control, you can build into their life before the problem gets to the point where they explode. You can start building in breaks that they are either reminded of every 20 minutes by an adult. Say, hey, you need to take a break. Or the kid is old enough and has the capacity, give the kid the ability to leave a stressful situation before they explode. These are all skills that we learn and we sort of know how to do. If you're in if I'm at a bad cocktail party where I'm underdressed or I don't know anybody or something like that happens, I go out and I'll play on my phone for 10 minutes or just recalibrate and go. And these are skills that we learn as typically developing people rather easily. What schools have the obligation to do is to sort of provide those supports. If aggression, Lou talks about it being a felony if you touch a cop. It's also a felony if you touch a teacher, okay? A lot of kids get into the juvenile justice system and stay there because they, have a meltdown and some teacher tries to intervene, doesn't know how to intervene, and ends up getting hit during the process. If the school doesn't have good supports available in-house, and even if it's the law, not everything that's the law is commonly available. What they'll do is they'll use the resources that they know about. They'll call the school resource officer. They'll call the district justice. They'll call the local cops. If you've got that type of aggressive kid, what we can talk about is a behavioral support plan where there's adults supervising, and the plan would look like some variety of this. Create antecedents to try to avoid the behavior in the first place. So it could be things like social skills instruction, anger management classes, counseling, anything that for kids who get upset by academics, making sure that the academics are at the right instructional level for a kid. There's all sorts of things you can do to avoid the problem from taking place. A replacement behavior would be the second part, a behavioral replacement, which would be when you see a kid who starts to get frustrated, instead of letting it get to the point where they're aggressive, you intervene and you give them another option. Say, you take control of the situation. You try to make sure that whatever the social situation is that's frustrating the kid, that there is a more structured way of resolving that than just having something deteriorate into an argument or a fight. And then rewarding kids for when they use that positive behavior replacement and give them some sort of positive reinforcement for it. Hi.
So I have a question for you. I love everything that you talked about. So what do you do with
So,
they absolutely said, you know, we've tried to negotiate, we've tried to have several meetings, and the answer is no. You need buy-in from your administration and also your entire school staff to produce a school climate that is positive for every student to thrive in.
sure. So the question, in case everyone didn't hear it, was what do you do when you're met with, and I'm going to summarize your question, when you're met with resistance from the school and the school doesn't want to buy in, I think were your words, buy into the idea of providing these sorts of behavioral supports. And the first step is, I think, for every parent is to just become educated about what the law provides and try to advocate as best you can for your kid. The second stage would be working with professional advocates. You know, we're really fortunate that we have some extraordinary professional advocates and also good lay advocates in Allegheny County and Western Pennsylvania. And if need be, you can bring an attorney in to fight for what, you know, your kid needs. But these problems, I think, primarily aren't what it's not that schools don't want to do this stuff. I think in many instances it's schools not being aware of what their obligations are. And what happens is if you work for a bureaucracy, and I also work for Allegheny County, and I know about, you know, big bureaucracies. Big bureaucracies, you know, you do what the bureaucracy tells you to do and what the pattern is of practice. And changing the way that an institution does business, it's a really hard, difficult process. And part of what our model is we try to get buy-in from people and sort of say, look, we're going to make this easier for everybody, for your school staff and for the kid, if we do these changes. There is, if advocacy doesn't work, there is a system where disputes can be resolved by an impartial hearing officer. And while most of our cases that we handle, we never need to go to that stage, if it's about what your kid getting the right behavioral supports or not, that's something that a hearing officer will decide whether or not a school needs to change how they're treating a kid. Did I answer your question okay? I want to talk about just a couple of things, because, and again, I don't know where I'm coming up again. I'm okay? Okay, just a couple of simple things that I think that people need to know about behavioral supports. Behavioral supports should be based upon a functional behavioral assessment, which is where the school conducts a structured observation and data collection over time that focuses on the behaviors of concern, okay? This is it's not just sitting down and saying, you know what, I think the kid's a little anxious. Maybe we need to, you know, give him one of those squeezy balls on their desk. A good functional behavioral assessment should observe what happens before a behavior takes place and tries to come up with a hypothesis that makes sense in light of, you know, data collected from different venues, different times of day, different days of the week, different and different, you know, settings, supervised and unsupervised. If your kid's getting into trouble on the bus, it doesn't make sense to observe them at lunch. It doesn't make sense to observe them during math class. You want the observation and the functional behavioral assessment to address what the problem is narrowly. If you don't like what the functional behavioral assessment does, you can also request something called an independent educational evaluation, which is where you tell the school, I don't like your functional behavioral assessment. I don't think it does a good job of capturing what the problems my kid's experiencing are. I'm going to request that you provide me the opportunity to get one from a practitioner who doesn't work for the school district and have them come up with a second opinion. This is one of the most effective rights that a parent has, because what you can get is is compel the school to pay for someone who's neutral to come in and offer a second opinion. When a school gets this request, they have two choices. They can either defend their functional behavioral assessment in a due process hearing, which involves lawyers and time off of school and all sorts of things for their staff, making it difficult for their staff, or they can just write or authorize you and write you a check to get an independent assessment from a qualified practitioner. If this happens, if you're dealing with kids with disabilities and you are trying to get good information on how to address this before it goes into the juvenile justice system, my advice is to look into a professional called a Board Certified Behavior Analyst, a Bcba, okay? Their jobs are providing behavioral support for people with all sorts of different needs, from teaching them how to communicate for nonverbal kids, teaching them how to communicate, going on to helping kids with ADHD and impulse control disorder and ODD and anger management problems, and teaching them how to avoid getting into conflicts at school, which could lead to the juvenile justice system. Can you give us the name of somebody? There is a Bcba Directory. If you type in Bcba Pennsylvania or Board Certified Behavior Analyst Pennsylvania, it's a really good directory. It will sort of organize them in sort of their distance away from you. And it will talk about what level of training they have. There are master's level, or I'm sorry, certificate level Bcba, and then there's also doctoral level, Board Certified Behavior Analyst. What we find is that if you get someone in who understands the problem and is sort of not you trying to tell the school what to do as a parent or an advocate, but someone whose job it is to assess behavior, we find that that's very persuasive, and you don't need to fight about it if you bring in someone who says, look, we can make this easy for your school staff if you do this plan, if you implement this plan. One of the things that we feel really strongly about is that it can't just be a plan, though. It can't just be something on paper that teachers are supposed to do. There has to be someone designated to implement the plan wherever the kid is when the behavior occurs. There's got to be data collection of the plan to make sure that it's working, okay? And you've got to train people on how to implement the plan. So all these little things are sometimes useful and they're little steps, but these can make a huge difference in terms of whether a kid's successful at school or not.
So are you talking then about, so implementing the plan all across the board? You're talking about, elusive wraparounds, you know how hard it is to get into? So
the question was, are we talking about wraparound services? And
outside of the school setting.
Outside of the school setting. It's the equivalent of wraparound services, but wraparound services, I'm sure a lot of you know, aren't designed to be implemented in the school setting. It's the school's obligation to develop the plan and to staff the plan and to train the people and to collect the data. So it's an equivalent of a BSc with a TSS, except it's run by the school, it's provided for free by the school, and it's their obligation to do so if that's what's necessary to keep the kid in the least restrictive environment, which would be their home school. Okay. I think I'm coming up on my time. Hi.
So when it comes to the training for that staff to support that child, right, what's the time frame? Because sometimes they'll say, oh, we're not going to have that training for 3 months, 4 months. So here the child is falling behind because they haven't had the support.
So after a child is identified with a disability, the district has an obligation to implement an IEP within 30 days. Now, whether or not all the training gets done at that point, whether or not it all happens, you're dealing with practical difficulties like scheduling and people's workloads, and I would say you have a right to have this done in a reasonable time. What a reasonable time period is can vary from from place to place and situation to situation.
What would you say reasonable time?
I would say within 30 days of the IEP, of the FBA being done. If there's an FBA and a behavioral support plan, everyone should be trained within 30 days as a ballpark. That's reasonable. If it takes longer than that, then I think you start getting into questions of why that hasn't happened. It's important, especially one of the things that's really important is for parents to understand and professionals who are working with schools to understand how many other obligations schools are competing with. We are very used, those of us who work with the disability community, we're very used to our priorities being the top of the list. It's not at school. There are many other things which schools have to take care of, and part of our job is sort of adjusting expectations to understand why, why my kid who has these incredibly significant needs, why they're being not met quickly. And the reality is you're dealing with a large bureaucracy, and when you're asking them to do something new or do something that they're not good at, it takes time for them to get good at it. Okay. There's a lot else in this document which I didn't get to. This is actually a larger document, a larger presentation which we present to juvenile justice professionals. If you've got any questions about any part of this, please feel free to talk to me after this presentation. And our firm's phone number is on the front. If you have a question, even if you think it's a dumb question, even if you think it's a silly question, but you can't get an answer to it, but you need it to help your family or a family that you're working with, please feel free to call us. We think that part of our job, and I think Lou will talk about this as well, is making sure people get good information. We don't care whether or not you work with us or not. We just want you to know what you can expect that's reasonable, and make sure that, if you can solve a problem that otherwise you'll be talking to us in 2 years about, give you the tools you need to solve those problems. And then what ends up happening is that if it doesn't work out, you know how to get a hold of us as well. So please feel free to reach out with any questions or thoughts you have if we can be helpful. Okay. Thank you.
You have to read that there. I'm a bit of a wanderer, so it's probably best if I come to the middle. Good morning, everybody. My name's Stacey Condi. I'm a manager for Justice-Related Services, which is under the Office of Behavioral Health in the Department of Human Services here in Allegheny County. I've been with JRS for a little over 10 years, and prior to that I worked in alternative housing, which, to kind of put in easy terms, is essentially like halfway back programming for adults who are in the justice system. So a lot of my work experience has been specifically, well, all of my work experience has been specifically with individuals who are adults who are in the justice system who have behavioral health needs, okay? So I'm also pretty casual in the sense that if you have a question that pops up along the way, please stop me. I am not naive to the fact that there's a lot of terminology related to the justice system that is not common language for everybody. So if I get ahead of myself using some terms you're not familiar with, just stop me. So to talk a little bit about what justice-related services is, and we're shifting gears here a little bit. We focused a lot on juveniles and kids, and I'm going to focus on the adult population, 18 and older. But justice-related services does work with all adults. Everybody that we serve has a behavioral health need, and they are all involved with the criminal justice system at some point along the criminal justice system, okay? We provide our services during and following their court proceedings and their incarceration, okay? And ultimately, our goal at justice-related services is to help folks get out of the justice system, get the necessary supports in place to then help prevent them from going back in, okay? So in a nutshell, that's our focus. Our staff are essentially case managers with a lot of different backgrounds. We have staff whose backgrounds are in criminal justice. We have folks whose backgrounds are from the ID system, mental health, substance abuse. We even have some previous educators that work with us. So we really have a wide array of professional and educational experience on our team at JRS. So I want to touch on quickly, to give you some idea of really the functionality, the sequential intercept model, which some of you may have heard of the sequential intercept model before, which really is just a model that identifies where the behavioral health system and the criminal justice system meet, okay? So there's various intercepts that they meet at that provide opportunities for diversion. So at JRS, we try to function along that model to provide services and supports that can coincide with that intercept and divert folks out of the system, okay? So at JRS, we have a lot of different units because we are trying to come into play at each of those intercepts, okay? So there's a lot of units at JRS. It would be hard to be an expert on all of our units, although I am going to touch on each of them quickly today. But what you need to know is the service we provide across those units is essentially the same. Okay. The main difference that might apply is, one, where the individual's case stands in the justice system, and two, how long our service is going to be involved. Okay, we have some short-term units, we have some long-term units, and I'll try to touch on that. So the first thing all of our units will do is an assessment. We try to do a pretty comprehensive assessment, trying to get an idea of who the individual is, what their needs are, what their life has been like, really getting a holistic picture of who that individual is.
Just going back a little bit, how does this even start? Right? Is it something that the person that's involved with the justice system seeks out, or do you seek out? Do you get a list? How does it go?
So it depends. There's a number of ways somebody might get involved in our services, okay? The most common referral source, I hate to say it, is the jail. Somebody's already made it into the jail. We're working to educate folks, including police officers, about referring to us before they even have to hit the jail. But that is the most common referral source. Anybody can refer an individual to our services. The starting point for referral is they have to be, and I'm going to say it is dependent on our unit, but a criteria is pending criminal charges, okay? We do hope for every opportunity for diversion, even in a pre-booking sense. And when I say pre-booking, they may have been identified as potentially committing an offense, but there's opportunities for them to not be booked into the jail. So we do, bless you, have a staff person who is at the jail, who can identify when someone comes in on a new charge that they may have a behavioral health need, that we could divert them right back out. And there's some court procedure that happens in their arraignment where they're looking at bond that we might be able to say, well, maybe they can be released, and there's different types of bond, and we'll connect that individual to treatment, and they don't even have to be booked into the jail. Okay, so there's different opportunities where somebody might get referred to us, where we might kind of catch them in the system. We kind of have a number of things in place. So we have the staff down at the jail who's checking the list. We get notified whenever anybody that's previously been involved with us hits the jail, so that we know they're back in and can get them in services again. There's all sorts of providers that refer to us pretty frequently. So oftentimes probation officers, parole officers, maybe they have somebody in the community who is struggling and is really riding that line of violating their probation or parole, and they'll reach out and refer to try to be preventative. So really there's a number of ways someone will come into services. I'm sorry? So pretrial services as an entity is a different thing than JRS. We work closely with pretrial when it comes to that pre-booking piece. So there might be an opportunity that pretrial has said this person is minimal risk, and we're able to work with the magistrate and say, okay, pretrial has evaluated minimum risk. We have a treatment plan in place. Let's work together to not even put this person in the jail. So they're their own entity, but we do work with them. Yeah. After we do that assessment, we create what's called a service plan, and that's a 2-page document. It has 10 stipulations on it. that really focus on the person's treatment needs, okay? So we're looking at where that person may live, where they may go to treatment. We talk about taking medication, following through with any case management services, and there's a few other stipulations from there. It's important to know that JRS is a voluntary service, so we can't, nor would we want to force somebody to take our services, but it, of course, looks different in the adult system where individuals have the right to make their own decision about services. So we do sometimes have families who say, but my son or my husband or my sister really needs this. They really need this. And unfortunately, we have to say, but they have the right to say no, of course, unless they have a guardian or some other system in place, okay? If the person agrees to services, we will attend all of their criminal court hearings with them here in Allegheny County, okay? And what we do is we present that service plan to the court. Okay? So we are not attorneys, okay? We serve as an advocate in that role. We serve as the case manager. So really, we are just there to say, if the court is in agreement with it, if you are willing to let them out of jail or stop them from going in, this is what we can offer. This is the treatment we will help connect the person to. This is the housing we'll connect them to, and kind of all the services in between. 9 out of 10 times, the judge will go with our plan. Okay? Fortunately, I would dare to say that our court system is becoming more progressive in terms of trying to connect individuals to treatment and diverting folks out of incarceration. So we do have success with getting individuals on these service plans and out of incarceration. Once the person has, or I should say once the court has agreed to that service plan, it becomes a condition of their sentence. And what I mean by that is it's usually part of their probation. So when you get on probation, you have a list of rules you have to follow, and one of them will be to follow through with a JRS service plan, okay? And at that point, it's no longer voluntary, and we do have an obligation to keep the court and probation informed how that individual is doing. With that being said, we are advocates through and through, so we realize that the person may not be successful on that initial plan, right? We might need to tweak the plan. We might need to look at different levels of housing and treatment for that person's needs. So although we keep the court and probation updated, we would never call and say, well, they messed up, put them in jail. Never. We're going to call and say, hey, let us try this. And usually they will let us do that, okay? So once we get an individual out of the jail, if they were in, we really start working on putting supports and treatment in place. So we can do referrals for other types of case management. We can do referrals for different levels of housing. Sometimes somebody might have family, friends, or their own home. Other times somebody might need to be in a more structured housing setting where there's staff on site who could assist them day to day. Sometimes we have folks who maybe have a more primary drug and alcohol needs, so we're looking at drug and alcohol rehab programs. So all over the spectrum of services, we will refer to meet their needs. Treatment-wise, everybody who is with JRS is linked to the necessary treatment. So I know that's a broad term. That can mean a lot of things, and that's what we do. So if they need mental health treatment, if they need substance abuse treatment, we have folks who have more specialized treatment needs. So we do have individuals who have been convicted of sexual offenses and are required to do sex offender treatment. We have folks who might need anger management, a whole broad array of services and treatment they may need, and we will do those referrals. We also help assist linkage to benefits. So we realize that somebody needs access to insurance to be able to get treatment. If somebody wants to apply for any other disability benefits, we can help link them to do those applications. We also, before we even get somebody out of the jail, the application's done for insurance, so there's no gap in the care that they can receive. We also can provide a little bit of initial funding for primary needs. So I realize that if somebody comes out of jail and they don't have food in their belly and they don't have warm clothes on their back it's probably unreasonable to expect that that person could get to their court-ordered treatment or court-ordered appointments or stay out of incarceration, right? Somebody touched on earlier about kind of the survival. We have to think about people's survival mode, right? So we will put any of those initial needs into place, help provide funding for food, rent, clothes, state ID, birth certificate, help them get their Social Security cards so basic needs are met. Okay? We can also assist with a little bit of transportation. We don't have a whole lot of funding in that area, but we do have sometimes bus cards we can give so folks can get to their appointments. So once we've kind of worked to put all of those services in place, our goal is to help keep them there, and then we might, if it's a short-term unit, close the case, or if it's long-term, we might be open for months or years on that case. Okay. So that's what all of our units will do. To run through, and there's a lot of information on each of the slides about all of the units we have at JRS, and I'm not going to run through all the bullet points. I'll just briefly tell you what they do. So the first one that's listed, it's on page 3, it's slide 5, talks about police-based crisis intervention team. And JRS is not, this is not a unit of JRS. Rather, our involvement with crisis intervention, let me go back, and I believe Lou also participates in this training. But the crisis intervention team is a training that is done here in Allegheny County. They try to get all City of Pittsburgh police at some point, and they also try to get at least one officer from every municipality in Allegheny County to go through the training. It's not always possible. That's the goal. And it's a 40-hour training where officers are essentially learning about mental health crisis. I believe Lou presents around autism. Okay. And they talk about safety escalation. They talk about wellness for the officers. There's a broad range of agenda for the day: medication, suicidality. I believe they also talk about juveniles and mental health. And I participate from JRS to educate officers on using us as a resource. So if you encounter somebody as a police officer who's having a crisis as a result of their behavioral health, call us, right? We can help connect them to services, and the officers, and Lou touched on, any agency, entity is going to have some bad eggs, or even maybe not their bad eggs. Maybe they're just not interested in anything beyond kind of the day-to-day responsibilities. But I would dare to say most want to know more. Most want, because it makes their job easier too, right? If I provide officers with information about how they can connect an individual in crisis to services, that makes their job easier. So we try to inform them, hey, this is how you can refer someone to us. This is what we could offer if you do. And we also have an on-call line that officers are taught, hey, you can call even if you're not on daylight shift, and we'll tell you how to help, okay? So that's JRS's involvement with the CIT training. The first unit we actually have then is our diversion unit. So I mentioned that sometimes we can try to catch cases that are really early in the system. Sometimes they may have been booked into the jail. Sometimes they may not have been booked into the jail. And our goal here is to attend their magistrate hearing with them. So if you're not too familiar with the justice system, what happens is whatever area, jurisdiction, the individual has been charged with a crime, and that's the magistrate they will go in front of, okay? And our goal is that we will attend that magistrate hearing with them, present that service plan I talked about, with the hopes that the magistrate, if the person is in jail, will say, I will modify their bond, is what it's called, to let them out, so that they aren't in the jail, they can go home or wherever is recommended and get the treatment that's needed. And they may have to come back in 30, 60, 90 days to see how they're doing. Maybe not. There's a plethora of things that can happen at a magistrate level. But the goal is that's our first opportunity to pull someone out of the system. We also work really closely with the attorneys at the magistrate. We have a lot of interactions with the police at the magistrate around getting charges reduced, withdrawn in an ideal world, and then if we can't, getting bonds modified to at least get them out. So again, we're looking at how can we get them out of jail, and if possible, can we just stop this right in its tracks in terms of where it's going in the justice system. Does that make sense? Okay.
So when I see in here, it says an additional state grant in 2010 supporting substantial CIT training certification. So is that grant money still coming in? Just want to make sure you have that grant money.
So it doesn't go through us. It actually is managed by the police, and I don't know if you've heard anything about the current status of the grant that they're utilizing, but the program's still in place. Somewhere they're receiving funding, so I imagine the grant is still in place for them.
And we want to make sure that those supports are there and that funding is there.
It's also, I'll mention about CIT, the Cit National Conference is going to be in Pittsburgh in 2020, which is a huge thing. Yeah, it's a huge, huge conference.
I think it's international.
It may be.
Yeah, I think it is. Fun.
And so August 2020, the registration for it opens this next Friday, the 15th. So if you're interested more in the CIT piece, and I think in the spring, for anybody who is interested in this type of thing, I think in the spring they're going to open up the call for papers for anybody who might want to speak or share in some way at the conference. But.
And what is the national pilot thing you have on?
So the national pilot goes back to actually kind of the beginning.
Okay.
Yeah. And see, I'm sorry.
You have to register in 2019 for this.
Yeah, and I don't know how long the registration is going to be open, but it starts that day. It'll probably be open for quite some time. Yeah.
It's going to be at the convention center, so they'll have room.
Yeah, it's a huge conference, so yeah, I imagine the registration will be open for some time. And I want to say the dates of the conference are August 24th to 26th. I know it's in August, near the end of August. Okay, so moving on from diversion, I'm going to talk quickly about our IL unit, which is independent living. Some who work or have family who are in the juvenile system may have heard about independent living programming. So in this unit, we're looking at individuals who were involved with CYF at or prior to the age of 16. And in this unit, we serve, and I hope this doesn't offend anybody, I still refer to 18-year-olds as kids. So I'm going to say we're looking at kids who are 18 to 21 who are engaging with the adult justice system for the first time, maybe, oftentimes, okay? And that doesn't mean they haven't been involved with the juvenile system, but for the adult system. So really the goal of this unit is grabbing that population and getting them out of the jail. We want to stop them from spending a lifetime of cycling through the adult system, okay? Because as many of you may or may not know, the juvenile system is a beast within itself. But you get to the adult system, you hit 18 and you go in front of a judge, as I think Lou touched on it, kind of that whole background of what it was like in school for you, the services you had, that is out of the mind. So it's another animal, and we want to be able to catch those kids and get them out of the system. Okay? Go ahead, Barb.
It's my understanding that although the criteria is 18 to 21, if they're involved, they will work with the individuals until they're about 24.
So, yeah, there was some discrepancy around it in recent months about what age was supposed to be served, and I don't know where they landed on it. That's not my primary unit.
I think it's 24.
Because we had our range that we would serve 18 to 24, and then it came up saying, no, it's supposed to be 18 to 21, but I don't know what they landed on. It might be that you have to be 21 at the time of referral,
Exactly.
but they can keep being served through 24.
I think that's what it is.
Yeah, yeah.
Or you can be, if you were involved and you closed and you had other issues, they could be re-referred until 24.
And that one I'm not sure of, Barb. I'm not positive on that one. Yeah. I don't know where it landed. We then move into some of our treatment courts. So some of you may or may not have heard of mental health court, drug court, DUI court, veterans court. So in Allegheny County, we are pretty fortunate that we are meeting the needs of a lot of specified adult populations. Those four that I mentioned just happen to be four that JRF actually provides day-to-day staffing for. There are some other courts in Allegheny County that are supposed to be for a certain criminal charge that we don't necessarily staff. So there is a sex offender court, there is a domestic violence court, and there's also, I think it's kind of on a hiatus right now, but there was or is a pride court, which is around prostitution charges, where they actually see a lot of cases that the background is actually trafficking. So JRS will attend any of those courts, but again, we have staff who are directly involved in mental health court, drug court, UI court, and veterans court. The really nice things about these courts is that there's a team approach. So there's a specific district attorney representing the Commonwealth. There's a specific public defender or private defense counsel working in that court. There's probation officers who have probably some advanced knowledge or training in that particular area. So mental health court, for example, their probation officers get more training around mental health. Our staff who are present on the team, and then one judge that's seeing those cases. So it's a team approach where we are always looking at how we can get somebody in treatment, keep them in treatment, and the goal is to stop them from going in and out of jail, right? So these are some of our long-term units. I mentioned some are short, some are long. These treatment courts are longer term. So if someone gets accepted into a treatment court, we're going to keep them open until they graduate. In some of these courts, graduation could be a year, 2 years. We've had people 5 years, depending on how long their probation sentence is, okay?
So you go into mental health court, so you have to plead guilty? Or
all of these courts, you have to plead guilty. None of these, unfortunately, that's something we're lacking in here in Allegheny County, if I can say so based on my opinion. We don't have pretrial courts. Pretrial court would be you don't have to plead guilty or be found guilty to go into the court. It would be that you would come in with the agreement that if you do really well and you proceed through your treatment, your charge might be withdrawn, or they might give you some alternative sentence. But there's opportunity to not just go straight to guilty, okay? But ours are post-conviction.
That's very important if they get SSI or SSDI, because if it's a felony, they lose that insurance.
It is an important piece. I will say that the assistant district attorney who's involved with mental health court and with veterans court, because it's the same person, she does try, when possible, to offer a plea that it takes into account, okay, well, we could reduce this so it's not a felony. And I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to misspeak, but I know that there are some things when it comes to minimums and what ranges that they can offer pleas within, and so they only have so much say, and for that reason, some of those courts won't take certain offenses where there are mandatory sentences. So they try their best to say, okay, where's there some give here on this offense? And they're always trying to think progressively about that. Like, for example, in our veterans court, for a long time, they weren't taking violent offenses, which we have veterans returning home from deployment. There's a lot of instances of PTSD, and we have veterans who are coming home and committing violent acts, right? We see high rates of domestic violence, and many of our veterans are used to carrying a weapon. They come home, they're still carrying a weapon, things happen. So they have started to take some of the violent offenses where the ABA has had to look at some of those guidelines and what she might be able to offer without getting in trouble and what have you. But it is a huge piece. If we can divert folks from having felonies on their record, it's going to impact benefits, employment, housing, a whole range of things. So you're so right. I think I saw somebody's hand here first before. Maybe not.
I want to say that also in situations where things like that happen, the attorney, I used to be one of the attorneys in the courts, and one of the things that we would do is some post-trial, post-conviction relief. So if there were situations where somebody was maybe accepted a plea that maybe wasn't entirely appropriate for what they had done and it was affecting their benefits, I'm not saying it's a guarantee, but there are options for mitigating some of the effects of that.
Thank you for adding that.
Just because it's happened doesn't mean it's not fixable.
Thank you. Was there another hand?
So to give me clarity, you mentioned that there's a judge at each of those courts, right? So what is the continuity of that judge being, because that's a special court, how do you have continuity with a judge
So I will tell you the judges that are currently in each of those courts have been around a long time. So, for example, Judge Zatola is the judge right now for Veterans Court. I think he came into Veterans Court 2011 or 12. Judge Nauhaus, he's with Drug Court. He's probably been with Drug Court for close to 10 years. So the judges typically that are in those courts have been in those courts for many years. Typically, the continuity exists. Yeah, absolutely.
So could there be two courts that overlap on the charges? I'm thinking a veteran who's committed a DUI, so they would pick veterans.
They would pick where they fit best in the court's criteria. So I will add that for drug court and DUI court, they're looking at what, cases, I always say that like knocking on state prison's door, meaning that that person, their charges or their criminal history are to the point that they could be sentenced to state prison, but instead they have them take a chance in drug court or take a chance in DUI court, knowing that if they're not successful, it might be the end of the road in terms of diversion, and they might be sentenced to state prison. So in those cases, they might be too advanced, have too much history in the system to go into maybe mental health court. Maybe drug court's really the fit. If they're a veteran and they have mental health, they're going to look at which ones is the mental health really severe to the point the mental health court might be a better fit. So they're going to weigh it. And a positive thing, as I said, is the assistant district attorney is kind of the gatekeeper for Veterans Court and mental health court, and it's the same person. So it helps in continuity because she sees a referral come in and she could be like, this might be a better fit for mental health court. So there's continuity in that sense too, but they cannot be in two of those treatment courts at once.
There's a great deal of services that the JRS provides. What is the financial responsibility of the individual receiving those services?
That's a great question. None. Anybody that comes into our services does not have to pay anything. Our units some of our units are grant funded, some of them are base funded with county mental health dollars, some of them we bill somebody's health choices. There's a range of ways that we're funded, but there's never a cost to the participant or their families. Sure.
These courts, are they just in Allegheny County?
They're not, but not all of them are in every county. So like probably mental health court and drug courts are the biggies you'll hear in a lot of counties. The general surrounding area does have a frequency of veterans court, but no, it's not guaranteed in every county. Some have none of them. Some have one. Some have, yes, but it's not guaranteed across all counties. And so the way those treatment courts really work is bringing somebody in regularly in front of the judge and the whole team to see how they're doing, okay? And to look at further opportunities for diversion if the plan isn't working, okay? And there are pros of graduating the courts for like Veterans Court and Mental Health Court, for example. If you're successful in the program, your probation could be cut in half. Now, it depends on how long your probation was and how long it kind of takes you to get on track with your plan, but there is that opportunity there. And again, you have a whole team of support. So I will mention in Allegheny County, the probation caseloads for somebody who is what they view as low risk, those caseloads are immensely high, immensely high. So somebody who is on a low risk probation, by design, is not seeing probation in the court very often. And for some folks, that's a really great thing. And for others, they might need more regular support, and these treatment courts can offer that. So if somebody's not eligible for one of those treatment courts that's really looking at a specific need, then we do have what we call our county support unit. And this is on page 6, slide 12. And our county support unit, I kind of call our catch-all unit. So maybe their case has made it past the magistrate. They're now at the big court. That's what I call Court of Common Pleas, downtown on Grant Street, big court. And They could be at any stage of the court process up at big court, and they could be in our county support unit. So this unit goes to any of the judges, no matter what courtroom it's in, and they'll advocate for that person in front of the judge. Okay. Sometimes we have folks who can't be diverted. So the reality is that sometimes somebody's offense or their criminal history it could lead to them getting a state sentence. Okay. And what that means is instead of going to the Allegheny County Jail, they'll be sent to one of the 24 prisons around Pennsylvania. For anybody who hasn't had a lot of familiarity by one way or another with the state prison system, they do try to some degree to keep folks on their half of the state if there's a prison that can meet their needs. They have certain prisons who have mental health units. Some don't. They have different levels of security. There's a lot of factors. Of course, we were impacted in Western PA when FBI Pittsburgh closed because we had right here at home a local institution. So now there are some folks that are going an hour. I guess our closest prison right now is an hour away. So they will try to keep them closer to home, but of course they're going to be at least an hour away, if not further. I think our furthest prison from here is probably FBI Chester, which is past Philadelphia. FBI Waymart, which is actually where people typically, if they're on a mental health commitment in the state system, would be. And that's in far northeast side of the state, as far as you can go, the border of the state. So JRS does assist in those cases too, though, because if somebody has served their sentence in state prison and they're returning back here to Allegheny County, we do have staff who will travel to all of those prisons to help with treatment planning. And we will advocate to parole for when they go in front of the parole board to say, hey, here's the treatment we could offer if they're paroled. Or maybe they're not on parole. Maybe they're served the whole sentence, they're getting out regardless. And we'll offer them treatment and housing supports as well, okay? So that's what I mean by trying to start from the very beginning by going to the magistrate and expanding the system to those coming out of state incarceration, of getting them connected to the services, okay? I don't want to forget to mention about, and I kind of touched on it, Lou made a comment about kind of IEPs or things that behavioral support plans people have had in the past, what their services were like as a juvenile. And one of my staff just had a conversation with me the other day about an individual who she said, there is an intellectual disability there. I know it. I know 100%. And this person has such small interactions with psychiatric staff and incarceration that it doesn't get caught. Their mental health diagnosis is off base. It's a mess. And that's the reality, one, of an overcrowded system. But two, the unfortunate thing is in this case we're like, well, now this gentleman's in his 40s. So what's he going to qualify for that's going to meet his ID needs? Where do you find IEP information, what their life was like in school? Half the time, unfortunately, some of our individuals might be poor historians for one reason or another. So trying to track down any of the information about what life was like for that person when they were a kid or a juvenile, whatever age range you're looking at prior to 18, is going to be nearly impossible, okay? So as family members, advocates, support, and I'm sure you do it, you're here because you want to be the ones that do it. Any information you could provide about that past is huge. You have a question?
So last month, we actually had a case. I work here at Achieva.
Okay.
And very, very similar that the support person that this gentleman had knew he had an intellectual disability, but she wasn't familiar with all the systems, and so they reached out to us. Now, luckily, he was from Pittsburgh, and we were able to plead with the school district to get us any documentation with his IQ on it. And then we provided that to the public defender and explained what a 52 IQ really looks like in, our world. And it was very helpful. I mean, not at that exact moment. The judge wasn't real happy with us, but, he only went to jail for a little bit. It could have been much worse.
That's huge.
So, you can call the school district. It just takes that
lot of you know, and I know from personal family experience, I've been the family member on the other line trying to call to get my family member help. I know what it's like to get a voicemail that doesn't get or leave a voicemail that doesn't get returned. I know what it's like to get passed around line to line to line. And I know what it's like to have somebody on the phone who's willing to give you about 10 seconds, and beyond that, they're like, so the fact that Achieva was there to support in that case was huge, huge.
Since we're all here, I would love to advocate for an IDD autism court because we're glossing over, like the system glosses over the fact of how do we do that as a whole? Like I would like to talk about that later.
I was recently brought on by the Office of Intellectual Disability to look into exactly that. And to, I am a licensed attorney. I worked with Stacey in that court. I was with OID for several years. Prior to law school, I was a community advocate, and then I went to law school because, as we all know, that's people who can actually make changes. So hopefully. I was in private practice for a few years, and now I'm back, and that's one of the things that we're looking at. We're looking at many, many different things, and if you haven't heard from me yet, you'll probably be hearing from me soon. But I'm looking at all the ways that the ID and autism service system intersects with the legal system, whether it's orphan court and guardianships, whether it's due process appeals with Medicaid, whether it's the justice system. So I'm working on all of that, so you'll be hearing from me in some way, but that is something that we are looking at.
And you're from the Office of Intellectual Disabilities?
Yes.
Is a business card on you?
I do.
I'll start asking around there. So in interest of time, I'm going to kind of keep progressing along here because there's a couple of important things I want to make sure you have, especially if you are family or natural supports of those who are have behavioral health needs or in the justice system. So the first is a couple entities you should be aware of. In our Allegheny County Jail, there are medical and psychiatric staff. I'll put it out blanket like that. What that looks like in actual play inside the institution might vary, so I'm not going to gloss over the reality that it doesn't function perfectly, okay? I will say that it exists. We try to work with them closely to make sure that our clients are getting their medication needs met. We meet with our clients in the jail, as we do at the state prison, so we can communicate, hey, I'll call the mental health director. My client was voicing today suicidality, homicidality, or maybe my client's voicing he can't sleep. My client's voicing that they're having a lot of nightmares, whatever it may be, they're extremely anxious. We try to be that advocate in the cases we're involved in. On the last slide, you will see I put the phone numbers, and I reached out to the Allegheny County Jail's mental health director to say I want to provide a contact for folks for the jail if there is a behavioral health concern. So the number is there for the mental health department as well as for the mental health director's office at the county jail that you could utilize. I also want to point out that there is a behavior assessment unit as part of the county that is really the entity for the court who's responsible for evaluations around competency. So somebody can't, the best way to explain it, somebody can't move forward with trial if they aren't, if they don't understand their offense, if they can't aid their attorney in their own defense. There's a whole plethora of things there. So there is possibility that if somebody cannot do that, that they might be put on a commitment and sent to Torrance State Hospital for competency restoration, is what it's called. Allegheny County, still not perfect, but they have done a lot of work, and probably many of you aren't ignorant to the fact that there was a huge lawsuit in Pennsylvania around this, around wait times to go to Torrance. So that, years ago, there was an individual with a public drunkenness charge, which in the grand scheme is pretty minor, who sat up at Torrance for a year. Insanity, right? So we've tried to prevent extended stays up at Torrance if it's not necessary, diverting folks who aren't competent faster. So we do have a staff person who goes to Torrance. So if somebody is not competent and will never be competent, we can get them out of Torrance directly and work with the courts to get the charges resolved or withdrawn.
If they improve with, once they're at Torrance and found competent, then they come back to Allegheny County, but then, or to jail, but then they sit and deteriorate and then have to go back to Torrance to become competent.
probably going to be a little bit hit or miss there. The jail was working on trying to set up competency restoration within the jail, and then that kind of fell apart.
The other issue people have in the jail, too, is if you have a disability, you can be put in protective custody, which is solitary confinement, and I've had 2 clients in this year that were nonverbal, that were basically nonverbal. And that we need to make that a humane, if we're going to do that with people, to make that a humane protective custody, not a punitive one.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I think I'm also from the Office of Intellectual Disability, and we've made a lot of strides over the last few years to make sure that we're partnering with the jail, that if an individual with IG does have that we communicate that to keep that partnership going, or, they will ask if, they have those, if they have an inkling, are we involved, et cetera. So I think the communication is helping so we can get the individuals the support they need, where they need it, and then also get teams a little more involved and talking so we can divert as soon as possible. I really think over the last, I would say probably 5 or 6 years, we've really worked really hard to bridge some of those gaps that we never had. And I felt that I had to bring that up.
Absolutely. Thanks, Barb. And the last comment I want to make is you'll see on the last couple slides, there's information about our criteria. There's contact information for our office as well as for me. If you call me, I'm not going to let you bounce around. I'm going to do my best to give you the information and support you need, even if it's not about a client of ours. And lastly, I do want to say, we all know or have different experiences in the system. I do want to say that Allegheny County is in a lot of ways making strides and continuing to make effort to change systems. But there's a lot of systems that are colliding. There is always going to be some bureaucracy. There's a lot to it, but please do have faith that we are trying in Allegheny County to make those strides to improve those systems as a whole, okay? And your being here to educate yourselves and have a voice in it only helps that. So feel free to use me as a resource. Again, my number's on the very back, okay? Thank you.
Any additional questions?
They're very welcome to. I would say that anytime somebody can encourage their counsel to reach out to us to see if someone might be eligible or what recommendation we have, that's only going to help all parties. You know, oftentimes we'll go to court and an attorney or public defender will just walk in and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're here. What's the plan? What's the recommendation? Because it just adds to their advocacy for their clients. So absolutely.
Anything else? We just want to thank Lou, Jeff, and Stacey for coming in today.